Hi, my name is Sheila Corona. Welcome back to another chapter of A Soul's Journey by Peter Richelieu. This is chapter 7 for those of you who are following along either in the free PDF that can be found by Googling A Soul's Journey by Peter Richelieu, or if you have the book like me, we're on page 85. This time I do not seem to have been asleep at all when I realized this morning that I was again in my body. The remembrance of everything that had taken place was clear in my brain, just as if I had been to a theater and had been asked to write down all the details of the play. Thus I was able to settle down with my pad and pencil and record faithfully everything that had happened. After taking the tablet, I looked at my little French clock, whose hands stood at 9:42 p.m. I did not try to go to sleep, but within a few minutes I found that I had slipped out of my body and was standing at the side of my bed with my sleeping form lying there upon it. Again I looked, and it was 5 minutes to 10. There was no one about, and I walked around my room, marveling at the simplicity of what, on the occasion of my first astral journey, had struck me as extremely complicated. I did not attempt to leave my room, for I remembered quite clearly that my Indian friend had said that he would be here at 10 o'clock, so I awaited his coming, quite sure that he would not let me down. Next time I looked at my clock, it was 10 o'clock. Still nothing happened. 5 minutes passed, and I wondered whether the whole thing was going to turn out a flop. I became more and more worried as the minutes ticked away, but refused to be tempted to experiment on my own. And just as I was about to look at my clock again, I heard the now familiar voice behind me saying, "Did you think I was going to disappoint you?" My friend stated that he was late because he had been helping a particular friend of his who had died that morning. He said this man had dreaded dying, and although he had been ill for many months, he had fought death right up to the end. He explained that this was quite useless, as his time had come, and although he had probably kept life in his body for a few weeks by his extreme willpower, in the end, death had prevailed. I watched my great grandmother do that. She was in the hospital for the last 2 to 3 months of her life, and she was mostly not there. Uh, I don't even think she ever opened her eyes again, actually. She would just nod and in agreement or shake her head. But I that's really interesting. I hadn't thought about that the last time I read this. The illness this man had suffered from for months had at last so weakened his physical body that it was impossible for the etheric matter to remain within it. He stated that he had been helping this man to get rid of his etheric vehicle, which he tried to keep with him, this being now the nearest thing to the physical life, the only life he understood. Getting the man to make the necessary effort of will to disconnect the etheric from the astral body round which it had wound itself had taken longer than usual. "He's all right now," he said, "and I have left him with some astral helpers who will probably wish to remain until, through practical experience, he learns something about the law." I asked him what we were going to do this time. He replied that it was desirable I should first get experience of passing from the lower to the higher spheres. He took a lot of trouble in explaining to me that although he called them higher spheres, they were not actually above each other, but rather all around us, being conditions of different density only. He suggested we should start our expedition from London, so we set off as we had done the last time, and in no time slowed down over what was obviously land. Almost at once, I recognized the huge city below us as London. The objects we passed on our way were in no way clear. I could just distinguish between land and sea. It was as if we were looking at a moving picture of scenery, which was being projected onto a screen at a very quick rate. There was no effort whatsoever in moving, and although it took us what seemed to be less than a minute, we did not arrive breathless in any way. We dropped down, as before, in Hyde Park. I was told that this was the best place to land, as, although we were going to Piccadilly Circus, to land there could easily cause me to get frightened, owing to the terrific traffic and the possibility of my feeling, quite erroneously, that I might get run over. If I were to get frightened in this way, my fear would be transmitted to my physical body on the bed in Colombo, which would immediately endeavor to attract its owner back to it. The fear having caused me in my astral body to return hurriedly to my natural form of consciousness, I should consequently awake with my heart thumping, probably remembering what I would describe as a beastly nightmare, one which need not resemble the actual facts at all. It might be that I had been run over, and the fright caused such an imaginary happening could result in unruly beating of my heart, as fear generally reacts thus on the physical body. As we came to earth, I saw the familiar setting I had so often seen in days gone by. It was a sunny evening, and there were many people out walking. Children with their mothers or nurses were playing about as usual, and not far off I could see the constant stream of traffic, cars, taxis, and buses that passed down Park Lane towards Piccadilly and Hyde Park corner. I'm sorry, I'm hearing something in the other room. I wanted to make sure no one's yelling for me. I suggested walking down Oxford Street, and although the pavements were crowded with late shoppers on their way home and shop assistants just released from their day's work, we were in no way hindered. As before, I felt the strange gossamer contact perceptible every time as I was forced to pass through a physical body, and it was quite difficult not to apologize. My friend, who did not like crowds, floated about 2 yards above the heads of passers-by. I soon did the same, and we came to earth again in Piccadilly Circus. Perhaps you would like to look at the scene of our last trip to London and see if you recognize any of the people in the foyer of the Trocadero, he said. I agreed, and we strolled in. The lounge was just filling up with people waiting for friends, with waiters flitting hither and thither, taking and executing orders. I saw no one there whom I knew, and no sign of either Charles or Roy Chapman. I wondered if the latter had become bored with the perpetual round of meals and drinks that did not have to be paid for, but I did not ask. My friend beckoned to me, and I understood that he wished to go upstairs. I followed without question, and soon we were in a corridor which had several doors leading off of it. He entered one of these rooms, which turned out to be a bedroom, untenanted. We had, of course, turn the page. We had, of course, gone through the door, so needed no key. Now, he said, we had better be on our way. I came to this room so that we could be quiet, for I want you to realize that passing from the lowest sphere to the one less dense than this is quite a simple matter, only requiring an effort of will for it to become immediately effective. I want you to hold my hand and just wish to do what I do. You will not feel anything, but will notice that the scene around you changes gradually. The walls that seem to enclose us in this room will appear to melt. The furniture with which you are surrounded will slowly become vague and misty, and all the time you must let go so that my will may dominate yours. Whatever happens, do not be nervous, for if you panic at all, you will very soon wake up in Colombo. Now, are you ready? I replied that I was, and I experienced no fear at all, only interest. I held the hand of my friend firmly and tried my utmost to allow myself to be controlled by his will, and almost immediately the walls of the room became blurred and indistinct. The same applied to the furniture, and in less time than it takes me to record, we were standing in the open air in a small field, and in the distance there was what looked like a typical English village. Now listen, he said, and you will hear very distinctly a distant rumble. That is the roar of London town, and it can just be heard because you are only one subplane or sphere away from what is the actual astral counterpart of the physical London you know so well. This is the second sphere of the astral world, and you can see already that it is very much less material than the densest part of that world, the part to which you go immediately after death. Let us travel a little, and you will see what I mean. We started off again, floating gently a yard or so above the ground, till we came to the village which I had seen in the distance. It was very much like an ordinary village, for there were shops, two cinemas, a magnificent hotel, which looked much too large for the size of the village, and on the outskirts there were at least three buildings, which were obviously churches. All around the village, stretching far and wide into the distance, I saw the most beautiful houses. Some were small, others larger, but every one was surrounded by a colorful garden in which the flowers of every sort bloomed in profusion. I saw both women and men working in those gardens, but obviously working because it was a pleasure, not because they had to. Dogs of certain kinds frisked about the lawns, and the voices of children could be heard as we passed by. Bear with me, I need a sip of water. One difference between these and similar houses in the world was the absence of garages, and I noticed that there were no cars on the streets. It was explained to me that there is no need for transport, for people can get from place to place by much easier methods, as they only have to express in thought the desire to go anywhere, and immediately they float gently from where they are to the destination to which they wish to go. I asked why there were shops when money was not needed. I was told that the people who find their happiness at this level like to live a life as near as possible to that they had always imagined as ideal when alive. Some spend money, my guide said. They create it by their own imagination, and they buy food which they prepare and even eat, all in imagination, because that is what they wish. But surely, I ask, it is quite unnecessary to have shops when a thought would be sufficient to produce in one's home what one wanted. These shops, he replied, have their origin in the minds of the inhabitants, and none of them exists in the world, nor do the people who serve in them. Once the residents here think a thing, it becomes a fact in this world of illusion. These shops are all figments of the imagination, together with the things that are sold therein. But so long as the people want to have shops near to them, they have them, for they imagine them. He continued, it is the same with churches. People like to continue their religious practices, even though after death they may have found that many of the statements made by their priests and pastors had not been entirely correct. The permanent inhabitants build these churches, and ex priests and ex ministers of religion carry on their old vocations, drawing round them followers, just as they did in the life that has ended. Cinemas, too, are very popular, but whilst there is unending variety on the first sphere, it is not quite the same on the second sphere. Here, cinemas are not the astral counterparts of such places in the world, but are the creations in thought of the permanent inhabitants. There are always ex producers of films or amateur producers who create new films in their imagination, and their thought forms are produced on the screen for all to see. These shows are in many ways better than those we see in the world and those which astral inhabitants see on the first sphere, for under astral conditions, producers can allow their imagination to run riot. There is no need to consider the cost of production here. Theaters are also popular at this level. Those who are interested in amateur theatricals, as well as ex-actors and actresses, produce one play after another for the benefit of their friends and acquaintances, and they are able to do so quite easily, as there is no difficulty in obtaining the correct costumes, scenery, or an orchestra, as these things are just created in their imagination and cost nothing. Some people still wish to live in hotels. Probably they are the people who have always thought it would be wonderful to live in one of the big hotels that were far too expensive for them in the world. Now, now they can live in such hotels. That is why this hotel looks so very large compared with the size of the village. Such a hotel could not exist in an ordinary village in the world, but here it does not need to make a profit. People live in the hotel and have all the service and attention they want merely by imagining it. So they are happy for a time. But surely all this becomes very boring after a time, I ask. Yes, it does, he said. Then the people look for something more satisfying in life, as you will see, for when their particular desire is no more, they are able to change to something else and get what they want. Many people are perfectly happy with this Arcadian existence, particularly those who have had a rather hard time during their earth life. Such people often spend 90% of their astral existence under these conditions, where they have the friends, pets, beautiful houses, and gardens which satisfy them, and only pass on to the mental world when they are more or less forced to do so by the urge of their egos, who wish to progress along the path of evolution. My guide now told me to hold his hand again and join with him in willing to pass from this second sphere to the third. I did as I was told at once. The scene that surrounded us started to dim and gradually gave place to a new one. Our surroundings were now quite different, for we were standing in an open space surrounded by what appeared to be dozens of small woods or coppices. If you can imagine a gigantic park with trees everywhere, with glades and dells intermingled with the clumps of trees. It will help you to visualize the scenery. There is nothing quite like it in our world, but I should imagine that from above it would appear as if one were over a gigantic Sherwood forest. In many cases, the open spaces were several square acres in extent, varying from a glade measuring perhaps 3 acres to open spaces covering what I would estimate to be a 50-acre field. All these glades were very picturesque, as everywhere there were flowering shrubs, while daffodils and forget-me-nots bloomed in profusion in the green grass. There were no houses to be seen at first, but later I saw odd houses, very large ones too, resembling the huge halls or manor houses that one finds in England, which in the old days were inhabited by the aristocrats or squires of the county in which they were found. We glided along, and I saw that in many of these open spaces groups were congregated. We approached one of these groups and found that there were perhaps 100 people watching an artist painting a picture on a canvas that measured about 50 by 30 feet. They were obviously enthralled by what they were watching, for no one took any notice of us as we joined the group. The artist was not using brushes, but he had in his hand a long stick resembling a fishing rod, and as he pointed the stick at different parts of the canvas, a picture appeared, first in rough outline, later in detail. As he painted, the artist spoke from time to time, explaining what he was creating. He made quite clear the impression that he wished those watching to have, and on one occasion he rubbed out part of the painting. I cannot use any other word for, as he pointed a stick, a portion of the picture was erased, and explained that his previous thought form had not been sufficiently detailed to get the effect he wanted. Again, he seemed to concentrate. The rod moved up, down, and across. A new detail, which blended in with the rest of the painting, immediately took form, and the second attempt at once emphasized the point he had made a minute or so before. I could not understand much of what the painter was talking about, for it was couched in technical terms only comprehensible to a brother artist. I was told that the artist was one of the great painters of the past. My guide stated that an artist would paint because the urge which made him do so when in the world continues after death. He does not have to use brushes and paint at this level, because he is able to express himself in color merely by projecting the thought. The fluidic astral matter answers to the thought form, and the picture appears, as if by magic. As the thought develops, although the canvas, I'm going to read that again. For some reason, it feels like I misread that. The fluidic astral matter answers to the thought form, and the picture appears as if by magic as the thought develops. Although the canvas was huge compared with the pictures we have in our galleries in the world, it was in no way cumbersome to create a picture of that size at the astral level, when merely by concentrating on a particular part of the canvas, the picture within the mind of the artist came to life. I cannot describe the glorious colors of which that picture was composed, for we have no words to describe the many in-between colors that were used. When I mentioned that I saw at least 30 shades of a color, which, if I described any of them, I would have to call red, you would realize how impossible it is to give anything but a very incomplete description of what I saw quite clearly. My guide explained that many of the great painters of the past who were still at the astral level lived in this sphere, and that they spent their lives creating, in the form of pictures, the ideas with which their minds were filled. At the same time, the artists taught any who cared to watch and listen to them the methods adopted in making pictures. I was told that it took only a few hours to create one of those huge pictures, and it often happened that the artist, having finished one, started at once to create another. But does the first one fade once the artist has withdrawn his attention from the canvas? I asked. No, replied my friend. It remains just as you see it now, so long as anyone is looking at it. You see, once a picture is created in astral matter, that picture remains static for anyone to see, so long as a single thought is concentrated on it. When all thought is withdrawn from it, then it gradually disintegrates into the main astral atmosphere and is lost forever, or until a new thought creates it again as a new picture. I watched until the picture was finished, fascinated by the skill of the creator and the results achieved. When the artist had moved away and was talking to some of the crowd who had been sitting round watching him, I saw that several of the other watchers, obviously students of art, started to create something similar for themselves, taking the master picture, if I may call it that, as their pattern. I still watched and saw immediately the tremendous difference between their efforts and those of the great painter. It was explained to me that the reason for such a great difference was the lack of knowledge of the student compared with the knowledge of the master. The students were unable to express in clear thought what they wanted to appear on the canvas, so the results were decidedly amateurish. Obviously, the canvas would only exhibit what they were able to express in thought, and I saw very clearly why that was so. Even in the picture galleries of this world, if one looks at a picture, it often happens that one is able to feel something of what the artist has endeavored to express. Such feeling is emphasized 1,000 times at the astral level, and looking at the great painting, I knew without any shadow of doubt what this artist wished to express in color and form. We moved off and saw many groups surrounding individuals doing similar work, but as the country was slightly undulating, it was practically impossible to see any two of them at once. In one of the valleys where a slow moving stream trickled along, there was a group seated on its bank, seemingly doing nothing. As we approached, however, I realized that this group was not watching a creative artist, but was producing sounds resembling a beautiful symphony played by one of our world-famous orchestras. I did not hear anything until we got quite close to the group. Then I found that the surrounding air was filled with the most beautiful music I had ever heard. In the center of the group was a man whose face seemed familiar to me, yet I knew that I had never met him in real life. I asked my guide who he was, and he whispered, "That is the celebrated Johann Strauss." At that moment, he was demonstrating how the sound of trickling water can be expressed in music. I remembered that it was Strauss who had composed the Blue Danube, and this music seemed to have much of the lilt found in that hackneyed but beautiful waltz. It was even more beautiful still, I should say. Whilst I stood enthralled, I saw on the opposite bank of the stream what appeared to be ethereal figures who in some way were part of the symphonic poem that I heard. My friend told me to look at these new people, for these are members of that parallel evolution I have told you about, the Deva kingdom, he said. But what are they doing, I asked, and why do they look different from the crowds that are on our side of the stream? It was explained that they looked different because they were indeed different. They were more ethereal because, being part of a different evolution, their bodies are different, and although made of astral matter, are at the same time less concrete than our astral bodies. I was told that these were some of the music devas, whose beings those beings who live and express themselves through sound, and that they were helping the composer who was seated on our side of the stream to express himself as he wished to do. Just how they helped I cannot say, for they never spoke, but seemed to concentrate on the creator of the music, and through their thoughts enabled him to express in more and more detail what he endeavored to create in sound. Volume of sound was there, and every note clearly heard. But I found that when we passed from the group to a distance of perhaps 50 yards, nothing was to be heard at all. It was difficult to describe these members of the Deva kingdom in words that are understandable. Their forms were beautiful, but as they moved, they seemed to vaporize. When they became still again, they were once more quite definite in shape. I think I can describe it best by saying that the bodies seemed to be made of mist, which only held together in a concrete way when the individuals remained more or less still. We went over to the opposite bank, but as we approached, these people seemed to glide away, rather like shy animals. They had no fear of us, but did not invite contact at all, and I felt that if we approached them with the intent to communicate with them, how that would be done, I had no idea then. They would have vanished into thin air. My Indian friend said that this impression was, in a way, fairly accurate. On, my guide beckoning me to follow him, we moved on. Soon I saw that he was making for one of the large buildings, which I had taken to be a huge manor house. As we drew nearer, I saw that the architecture was very beautiful indeed, and deep French windows overlooked the surrounding countryside. Spacious lawns gradually sloped away from the house, which was situated on the top of a rise. Flowers and flowering shrubs bloomed on all sides, and in the distance, perhaps 10 miles away, the sea could be seen if one looked carefully. It was a delightful spot. I wondered who lived here and for what purpose. We came down to earth on the terrace and entered the wide doors that led into a spacious hall, furnished as I would have expected it to be, but with one remarkable difference, that in the hall there were actually small trees and plants, principally roses, I noticed, blooming indoors, with the roots growing through the floor. There was no artificiality in this. One felt one was in an indoor garden, and the result to the eye was very pleasing indeed. No one seemed to be about, and there were no sounds of occupation. But my guide immediately led me to one of the doors that opened from the hall, and as the door opened, sounds of music met my ear. There was only one occupant of the room, and he was playing a grand piano in a way which showed that he was no mean exponent of the art. He took no notice of us but continued to play, and we listened, fascinated by the power of the musician over his instrument. There were a very there were a few very inviting easy chairs in which we sat down, and perhaps for a quarter of an hour the playing continued. As time passed, I seemed to recognize a similarity in this music to the Chopin preludes, and in a whisper to my friend I asked who the musician was. "Do you not recognize him?" he replied. "That is the famous Chopin, who is still expressing his great soul through the medium of sound in exactly the same way he used to do when he was alive." You will notice, though, that he does not look delicate here. For when he was in the world, he suffered much, and for a great part of his lifetime he was not a fit man. Now all that is changed. Here fatigue cannot trouble him, and he produces more and more beautiful music, which at times he allows other musicians to hear. At this level there are concerts all the time. Thus, there is never any difficulty in attending these functions if you are really interested and able to appreciate the beauty in nature that the musician is endeavoring to express in sound. I looked at the performer more closely and found that I was unable to recognize any resemblance to the likenesses of the great musician which I had seen, but my memory of these was vague, and probably I had not studied them very carefully. He stopped playing after a time and turned round to us, in no way perturbed or annoyed by our presence. He assumed that we were music lovers, so explained to us what he had been trying to express, and although he used some technical terms, I was fascinated by what he said. He emphasized that in his opinion every sound was a description of either color or movement. Progressions and blending of chords were sound pictures of beautiful gardens, and where cadenzas appeared, one should immediately feel the presence of a slowly moving stream, perhaps between two perfectly laid out gardens, and try to see the picture that the musician was endeavoring to express. I, who considered myself musical, at once realized how little I knew of the true art, and resolved that after death I would be one of those people who took up the study of music in a big way. It is unfortunate that in the world these masters of music are, in most cases, entirely outside the scope of opportunity of the average man who has to earn a living. We left as we had come, without any official leave taking, and as we withdrew, Chopin turned towards his piano and recommenced to play. As we closed the door and were again in the passage, no sound whatever came through the door. There was only the sound of birds, many of which, in diverse colors, flitted about, not only in the garden, but indoors also. My friend told me that this huge house was one of the great art schools which exist at this level of the astral world, and that hundreds of the permanent inhabitants of this world spend most of their time in learning something of the art in which they are particularly interested. I was told that tuition was always available, for all the great masters are willing to teach those who are anxious to learn, and that the opportunity is there at all times, for there is no night or day, and fatigue does not enter into one's calculations. But surely, I ask, people do not carry on studying and practicing day and night, week after week, month after month, and year after year in this way? Yes, they do. And as I've told you, they do not get tired, nor does time hang heavily when they are interested and enthralled in what they are doing. If you analyze your reactions at the physical level, you will find that time never drags when you are doing what you want to do. Usually, fatigue enters in and you have to stop, even though you are enjoying what you're doing. But here, that does not apply, as no one gets tired, and there is no time as we understand that term. You do not have to get home for dinner. You have no wife waiting for you, and you have no duties or responsibilities in any way. Those limitations just do not exist at the astral level. So the man or woman carries on with the work or relaxation that he or she desires without any thought of how much time can be devoted to that particular form of study or enjoyment. My guide then told me that he had a little work to do and politely asked my permission to leave me for a while. Go where you will, he said. No one will interfere with you, and I suggest you wander in and out of different rooms, for I can assure you, you will not meet with any hostile reception. This building is very like similar ones which exist here, and it will be well worth while for you to see more of what is done in such places. I shall return when I have finished my private work, and I do not think you will be bored whilst I'm away. From the outside, I had seen that the building had at least 3 stories, so I decided that I would explore a little, as he suggested. To start with, I went into some of the lower rooms. In one, I found a sculptor with a class of pupils explaining how a particular curve could be obtained. I stood a while, listening to his discourse, and some of his pupils, without speaking, smiled at me as I listened, obviously not objecting in the least to my presence. In another room, a quartet was practicing. In another, a single violinist was going over and over a particular passage, with a score of music in front of him. It was very similar to an academy such as I had seen in the real world, but with very but with the great difference that there was no fuss or hurry, and that all forms of art were represented. Also, it was very noticeable that the people concerned, although quite seriously studying, were so obviously happy and not tense in any way, like the students I saw the last time in the Royal Academy of Music in England. Later, I wandered upstairs, and here I had a very pleasant surprise. As I opened a door, and I noted with interest that here one did open a door and did not go through it as one would with a physical door, and went into one of these rooms. I saw a girl seated on a settee near to an open grand piano. She had a piece of music in her hand, which she was studying. As I entered, she looked up, and at once I knew her, for she was Daphne Hillier, whom I had last seen in England in 1935 when I met her at a golf club. The man who was my opponent that day knew her intimately. He introduced us, and soon we got into conversation. I saw her many times during my leave, and we got to know each other extremely well. I had thought several times of asking her to marry me, for I imagined I was in love with her, but somehow I did not. For one reason, I did not feel that I had yet enough money to marry on. Also, I wanted to get to the top of my profession before I accepted the responsibility of a wife. I returned to Ceylon, and for 2 years we corresponded regularly. Then it all ended by her contracting pneumonia, and to my great regret, her mother wrote to me to say that she had died. I wrote a letter of sympathy and gradually lost touch with the family, and now there was Daphne before me, seemingly very much alive and looking just the same as when I had seen her last, but with an even happier expression. In fact, her whole face radiated joy and contentment. And some of the joy, I flattered myself, was at seeing me. Daphne, my dear, is it really you? Yes, it is I, she said. But what are you doing here? You haven't left the old world yet. I know. So what has brought you here? I tried to explain to her something of what had happened and why I was here. She said she was surprised to see me because although most people who are evolved at all wander on the physical plane during the time that their bodies are asleep and recuperating for the following day, yet it is not common for living people to visit the third sphere of the astral world. In many cases, they do not know how to get there, and very few know of the existence of these different levels. But, darling, she said, now you are here, you will be able to come again, and we must see lots of each other in the future. There is much that I can show you. Although you never asked me to marry you when I was alive, I knew that you loved me, and I love you too. I then realized that it had not seemed strange at all for her to address me as darling, for I had so often called her that in the old days, and she me. And although all that was several years ago, it came back in a flash, and I felt again the same draw towards her, the same thrill at being in her company as I had felt in the old days. This is wonderful, I said, and it certainly will not be my fault if I do not see a great deal of you in the future. Perhaps you will be able to help me in this, for I do not know whether I could get here on my own, even though it all seemed so easy this time when I had a guide to help. I told her about my efforts in the recent past and how, apart from my first astral journey, I had not yet been able to bring anything through, even though I had tried very hard to do so. In future, I shall want to remember what we say and do. I wonder if I shall be able to do that. As I said these words, my Indian friend came into the room. So, you have found each other, he said. I thought you would if I left you long enough. It was just, it is just as well that you have found Daphne, for she can be of great assistance to you, and through your love for each other, many things may now be possible that were difficult before. For one thing, you will have a definite contact at this level, which you can concentrate upon as soon as you get out of your body at the moment of falling asleep. Your thinking of Daphne will immediately make itself known to her, for thought is a very powerful thing, and concentrated thought is not bound by different levels of matter. So Daphne, if she will allow me to call her that, and call her by that name, will know quite definitely when you concentrate your thoughts on her in just the same way as people know that you want them when you ring them up on the telephone. And I want to pause here and say, this is actually happening right now in the physical with many beings. And we sort of write that off, right? Oh, it's just a coincidence. I was thinking of you and then you call. I don't think that's coincidence at all. And then I read this and I knew that it wasn't coincidence. And it happens all the time. Sometimes, because now I actually play with this, I will send a psychic ping to someone and see if they can feel it or know it. And it's really fun to experiment that way. Daphne can, back to the book now. Daphne cannot easily come to meet you when you get out of your physical body and are on the lowest or first sphere of this world, but she can be your contact for passing from that first sphere to the third sphere where you are now, in exactly the same way that holding my hand acted as a contact for you when I told you to will that you passed first from the lowest to the second, and later on from the second to the third. You will find that by the exercise of your will, plus having a contact who knows the ropes, there will be no difficulty at all. He continued, you see, you do not know very much about the law of karma yet, the law that to a great extent makes your contacts and gives you the opportunities to which are so important to your evolution. This law of karma, or a law of cause and effect, as it is usually called in Christian countries, deals with every word, thought, and action of yours at the physical level. The mere fact of your having given affection at that level to Daphne, and of her having returned that affection, even though it did not come to the natural fruition of what the world calls marriage, means that you two have a link with each other, which sooner or later you must work out. There is a great deal to be said for the state of being in love, for whilst a person is in that state, or even imagines himself to be in that state, he wants to give, and for a short period does not seek to get anything in return for what he gives. Expressed differently, he exudes something that can be said to be the highest he can offer. That giving is a cause which must produce an effect. In other words, the law of karma must work its natural way. A real exchange of love makes an ideal partnership for progress in anything, for each one is only too willing and anxious to help the other in any way possible. So I welcome this contact of yours, and I do not mind admitting that I hoped you would make it. I could not bring you here deliberately, for that would have been interfering with the natural working out of the law of karma I mentioned. Presumably, it was your fate to meet again under these different conditions, and it is now up to you both to take advantage of the force of circumstances that has made this linking up possible. How fascinating is the working of God, of fate, of God, of fate. Had Charles not been killed, you would not have been so miserable that I was detailed to come and help you. Now, through your efforts to understand something of the evolutionary plan, you have been allowed to meet again a person whom you thought you had lost forever, or lost for the remainder of your physical life. I cannot guarantee that on a morning following a joint astral plane expedition, you will always recall all of your experiences, for the development of a perfect memory covering what you do when you are out of your physical body requires much practice, and so far you are only a very young pupil. I shall help you to remember what you have seen tonight, and when you write out your report of the night's happenings, you will realize how important it is to bring back into the physical brain cells the result of your wanderings. You will probably make a great effort in the future, which will gradually enable you to have the continuity of consciousness that is so essential. The mere fact that you have found someone in the astral world whom you were fond of in the physical world will encourage you to make Herculean efforts to overcome your limitations. Daphne can help you a great deal too, for having lived at this level for some years, she knows the power of thought. She knows too what can be done at the astral level and what cannot be done there. If you continue your efforts to remember what you do whilst out of your physical body at night, you will be able to carry on a second existence, as it were, a life which you lead only when your physical body is asleep. Daphne then took up the conversation by turning to my friend. But Achara, she said, as you say, I can be of great use to Henry now. Why was I not able to link up with him before? I tried so hard after I came to this plane, but even in the early days, when I was living on the first sphere of this world, I did not seem to be able to make any impression on him. Before he could answer, I interrupted and said, Look here, you two, do you know each other? You called my friend Achara, and he has never even told me his name, though, though I have seen so much of him the last few days. Is your name Achara? Yes and no, my Indian friend replied. It is certainly part of my name, and I am usually called that by those who have contact with me at this level. It is good enough for our purpose, so you two may call me that by that name if you wish. But soon you realize that the names by which people are known in the world, at any rate, the surnames are not as important after all. You, Daphne, could not get in touch with Henry. Wait a minute. You, Daphne, could not get in touch with Henry. Do you, Henry, realize that this is the first time that I have mentioned your name? Because he was not yet awake in the occult or spiritual sense. Consequently, he did not remember anything of what he had done out of his body, apart from stray dreams that were extremely muddled and incomplete. Therefore, when next he left his body, he had no concentrated plan, in thought, of what he wished to do. You talked to him, I know, but as you say, he did not seem as interested as when you talked to him in the physical world. When you expected him to remember what you had talked about a few nights previously, he seemed vague and dull. That was because he was not awake. It required some great tragedy, such as the death of his well-loved brother Charles, to make him clamor for light, for occult knowledge. There had to be a crisis, for through this the urge to know is born, and this is why we cannot awaken other beings. To me, this is why I take this to be saying, unless a person desires to know, no amount of us trying to say anything to that person will make a difference, because it is a choice. And just because we have made that choice does not mean that they will be interested to do the same, in my view. What a man really wants, he can get, providing he is willing and eager to work. Quote, knock and it shall be opened to you. Seek and ye shall find, end quote, said the great master, the Christ, and those words are literally true. But now we must get on, for I have more to show you before it is time for you to return to your body. Perhaps you, Daphne, would care to come with us. I would indeed, said Daphne, for I know that with your knowledge and help I can go to places which I cannot yet visit with my limited knowledge. First, have a look at your watch, Achara said to me, and see how much time has elapsed since you left your body. I looked and found that the face of my watch was strangely blurred. I tried to imagine what the time would be, and each time I thought, the hands of my watch changed to synchronize with my thought. I'm afraid I don't know, I replied, for my watch seems to change the hour with each thought that passes through my head. That is quite true, went on Achara, for you see, you are looking not at an astral watch, but at the watch that you have imagined on your wrist. You are used to wearing a watch, so you automatically raise your wrist every time you want to know the hour. The mere fact that you expect to find a watch on your wrist makes a watch appear on your wrist. For this is the world of illusion, and what you think at the moment is for the moment. You know, as a kid, I always wondered if the people who I was seeing in their houses through their windows as I walked by on the street, I used to wonder if they would disappear when I wasn't looking. And I wonder if this is partly why. Isn't that interesting? Huh. Now wait here and I will go and ascertain the exact time so far as we are concerned, for we are only interested in that time that exists in the place where your body is lying, and to know when you are likely to have to return to that body. The time that rules in the other parts of the world is of no interest to you in this case. As he finished speaking, he seemed to vanish into thin air. I had hardly recovered from my surprise when he was back again, standing beside me. He continued, I returned to your body, sleeping in your bedroom in Colombo, and the watch on your wrist there says 11:30. But surely my watch must have stopped, I said, for we seem to have been on the astral plane for hours and not just an hour and a half. Achara continued, you will soon realize that time seems different at the astral level from what you are used to at the physical level. It is quite true that only 1.5 hours have elapsed since you emerged from your physical body and we started our tour. And you will appreciate even more what I say when tomorrow you write down your experiences and realize what you accomplished in just 1.5 hours of physical plane time. You must have had experience in your physical life when you wake at 6 o'clock in the morning and realize that you had not to get up for at least another hour. You turned over, went to sleep again, and had a long, complicated dream that in time seemed to take a whole day. When you woke and your clock told you you had only been asleep for 20 minutes. What I have told you is an astral fact, which you must remember, for time does not exist at this level. We then left Daphne's workroom and were again in the passage. We floated down the stairs into the main hall and into the garden. No one seemed to be about, though we passed one man who was going into the academy to carry on with his studies, for he had a case under his arm that looked as if it contained a flute. He smiled as he passed, but did not speak. Achara said that he wanted to take us to hear a special symphony concert which the Deva kingdom was giving in a deep forest in a remote part of the astral world where humans seldom penetrate. He told us that he had obtained permission for me and for him to attend, and that he had no doubt that there would be no objection to Daphne coming along also, particularly as she was devoting a great part of her astral existence to the study of music. He explained that this concert would be quite different from any we had heard before because its object was not just to produce beautiful music, but its specific purpose was building up a vortex of power that could be utilized for influencing a particular important conference which was taking place in the physical world at the moment. He did not say what the conference was, but intimated that it had to do with the war, and that the decisions which were made at this conference would have a great bearing on the eventual result of the war. Also, the date when once again the world would have stopped fighting and would have decided to try and settle its differences by negotiation instead of through the medium of arms and munitions. He explained that such force could be built up in two ways, through deep concentration and through sound. This blending of chords, brought about by means of each individual taking part in the proceedings, concentrating deeply on the purpose to be achieved, built up a vortex of power which, when transmitted to the venue of the meeting through the medium of thought, actually influenced the people taking part in the conference. He gave as an example a group of people who were all irritable, some angry, and all more or less worked up. Before opening such a meeting, the chairman arranged for everyone to be served with a drink and to be allowed to smoke. At the same time, he made sure that each had a comfortable chair with the room warmed if it were cold, to a temperature to which people felt relaxed. The meeting opened. The chairman perhaps started the proceedings by telling a good story. A second round of drinks was served, and then the serious details of the agenda were tackled. What was the result? The people there who a short time previously were feeling irritable and ready to disagree with each other developed a camaraderie that made sensible discussion possible, and the work of the chairman was easy. No, not was. The work of the chairman easy. In just the same way, but to a much greater degree, the force generated by such an effort as the Deva kingdom was to make that night could be used to affect a group of men whose great influence could sway the destinies of countless millions of human beings. What they decided would indeed influence future humanity, so the work was certainly worthwhile. Without further preamble, we set off into the distance, floating about 5 yards above the ground, traveling at a great speed of about 50 miles an hour. This part of the astral world did not seem to be occupied by human beings. I cannot remember passing any individuals or groups of people as we sped upon our way. I noticed that the country was exceedingly beautiful, and that from time to time we passed buildings, either near or in the distance, that appeared to be similar to the academy which we had left a short time previously. There was a profusion of flowers everywhere, and numerous trees studded the countryside. Here and there I saw dense wooded patches of country, but we were traveling too quickly to notice anything significant about them. I think Achara did most of the talking, and as far as I remembered, he described the country through which we were passing, but my mind was so full with the wonders of my journey and what was still in store for me that I cannot remember anything particular to record. After traveling for what seemed like 10 to 15 minutes, I saw ahead of us what appeared to be a dense forest, and I remember Achara pointing out this landmark when we approached it as the end of our journey. He did not, however, come to earth at the beginning of the forest, but floated some feet above the tops of the trees for perhaps 3 or 4 miles. Then, our progress having slowed down to something approaching a walking pace, Achara led us through an opening in the trees where I observed there was a most beautiful open glade in the form of a rough circle, the diameter of which was possibly 50 yards. As we came to earth, there was no sign of activity, nor could I see anyone or anything moving in the open space before us. Where we were led to a huge tree, the roots of which gave us most comfortable seats, and were told to sit down and remain quiet. It is perhaps opportune that I mention my impression of the light in this open space or glade. We were surrounded by dense trees, like an Indian jungle, whose tops seemed to branch out so that the space at the top was very much smaller than the circle on the edge of which we sat. As I have mentioned, on the astral plane the light is bluish gray, much clearer than the most perfect moonlight, but it has not the bright, direct effect that sunlight gives. Visualize this glade as being perfectly light in its entirety. If a rabbit had run across the open circle, no one would have missed seeing it until it had run into the thickness of the jungle. We therefore had perfect vision of everything that took place, and at the same time were surrounded by dense forest into which little or no light penetrated. After sitting there for some minutes, I noticed a group of little men, like dwarfs, emerge from the forest on my extreme left, where they seated themselves cross-legged in a semicircle. As far as I can remember, there were about 10 of them, and each one carried with him an instrument which looked like a cross between a kettle drum and a tom-tom. I noticed they were dressed in little brown suits, with tiny shoes and caps made of a vivid green material far brighter than the foliage of the trees. Their features appeared to be those of middle-aged men, varying from 40 to 70 years of age, judging by Earth standards. Those of you who have seen Walt Disney's film of Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs will have quite a good idea of the appearance of these little men. They did not speak or make any sound. Soon afterwards, a group of much taller people emerged from the forest, both male and female, an entirely different race. They appeared to be nearer to the human type, but were definitely ethereal in appearance. The female members of this group were girls whose ages might have been from 18 to 25. All had long hair, either hanging free or tied with a blue or green ribbon. Both men and women were absolutely silent. This group numbered perhaps 35 in all, and they carried with them instruments, obviously of a musical character, but slightly different from the violins, cellos, clarinets, and flutes which we see in a Western world orchestra. They did not sit down, but ranged themselves so that those with the same type of instrument were more or less together, whilst all formed a compact group, standing perhaps about 20 yards away from the first group of little men. There did not seem to be a breath of wind, yet the top branches of the huge trees moved very slightly. An amazing silence prevailed for perhaps 2 minutes. Then all at once the little men started to use their drums. Almost simultaneously they began to chant in very low voices, which blended with the background of the drums without taking away from the beauty of the notes which came from the mouths of the little men. Obviously, it was a spiritual chant or mantra, for the very air was permeated with the outpouring of force, which quite definitely they were endeavoring to create. After perhaps 6 verses of this chant, the second group, or main orchestra, commenced to play. It is quite impossible to describe the beauty of the music played, which blended perfectly with the background of chanting and gentle drumming. The volume was not great, but it held one enthralled by its purity and beauty. What was being played was a symphony, for it had separate and distinct movements, with a main theme which was repeated from time to time. 2 complete movements had been played, and the orchestra was in the middle of the third movement when suddenly what seemed to be a human voice of astounding beauty rang out on the air. It seemed to come from above, and immediately I looked upwards. At first I could see nothing and no one. After some time Achara directed my attention to a distant tree on the opposite side of the glade, and there, at the very top, I saw what appeared to be a young girl of great beauty, sitting on the branches with her hair floating behind her, taking the solo part in this most beautiful symphony of sound. She was a pure soprano. Her voice had no great volume, but the purity of each note sung tore at my heartstrings so that I wanted to weep. And this went on for perhaps 10 minutes, the orchestra playing a few bars, then the girl coming in with an unaccompanied solo, later passing to the ordinary method of singing in company with the orchestra, gradually building up the power for which the music was being played. A fourth movement, which seemed to embody the spirit of the 3 which had preceded it, and entirely orchestral, closed the performance. The symphony simply faded away, and suddenly one realized that the silence, which had been so noticeable, surrounded us once again. I looked at the top of the tree where the singer had been. She was no longer there. The groups comprising the orchestra and the little men remained where they were, the members of the orchestra now seated on the ground. Out of the forest an old man appeared. He had a flowing beard and was dressed in ceremonial robes. He walked slowly and sedately to the center of the open glade, and raising his hands in supplication to some form of deity, started what seemed to be an invocation, for the 2 groups of players bowed their heads and listened to the words he uttered. I did not understand a word of what he said, yet I knew that it was a prayer, asking that the work which had just been completed should be successful. It was also an effort of will, for every member of both groups was concentrating to his or her utmost that the purpose might be fulfilled. It all ended quite suddenly and silently. The old man vanished into the jungle. Then the groups of players rose from their sitting position and, moving down the glade, disappeared from our vision. I was so affected by what I had heard that I did not want to move, and it came as rather a shock to me when Achara said, "Well, that is it. That is all for tonight. I shall be most interested to know how much detail you remember in the morning." I was still rather in a daze when we stood up and, floating through the opening in the trees, began our homeward journey. Achara gave us some idea of the purport of the ceremony we had just witnessed, but I am not very clear as to what he said, for my mind was still in a whirl, and I was thinking about the wonderful spiritual influence which had seemed to be the outstanding part of the concert from beginning to end. I remembered, though, that he described the different performers. He said that the little men were nature spirits, whereas the orchestra was composed of members of the Deva kingdom, which is a parallel evolution to our human kingdom. The latter were similar in development in their scheme of evolution to Daphne and myself in the human kingdom. The soloist was in a different category, for she was a very advanced deva and equal in that evolution to an exceedingly advanced individual in our evolution. The old man could be described as a priest, for he was dedicated to the priestly functions of that evolution and evolved through them in a way very similar to that which happens in the human kingdom. In due time we came to the academy and stopped on the lawn just in front of the entrance, because Achara said it was necessary for me to retain a clear picture of this building in my mind for future occasions. I asked Daphne how I could find her again, presuming that I was able to get as far as this building by my own efforts. Achara replied for her that I could usually be sure of finding Daphne in the same room that she had occupied when I first met her, for as there is no overcrowding in the astral world, most people can retain a particular working place for themselves. He, however, suggested to Daphne that she should show me the little cottage where she lived. Daphne was delighted at the suggestion and asked us to come and see it. She led the way by floating over the top of the academy, when to my surprise I saw what looked like a miniature garden city nestling in a valley about half a mile in the rear of the huge building. The houses, though small, were spread out so that each cottage had at least an acre of ground. It was quite apparent that each occupant had designed not only his cottage, but his garden in accordance with his own particular type of temperament and taste, and the result was exceedingly beautiful. There were cottages which might have been transplanted from any of the beautiful rural districts of England, others reminiscent of small villas in the south of France, others purely Italian in type, whilst I noticed at least two built to resemble Eastern temples. Achara noticed that I was interested in the different architectural types, so pointed out two cottages with domes similar to Mohammedan temples I had seen. He said they were owned by people who were particularly interested in having a room with perfect acoustic properties. Although I could have gone on gazing at this most wonderful sight, I sensed that Daphne was anxious to show us her home, so, with her leading the way, we walked along a rustic path for perhaps 200 yards. I have to take a pause here for a moment. It won't look like I've paused to you all, but I have to pause for just a moment. Okay, while I didn't lose my place, I am going to back up by at least one sentence there. Although I could have gone on gazing at this most wonderful sight, I sensed that Daphne was anxious to show us her home. So, with her leading the way, we walked along a rustic path for perhaps 200 yards. She led us through a gate into a garden, which was a veritable blaze of color. The cottage itself could only be described as a dream house. The design appealed to me immediately. In front of the porch there was a little lawn, in the middle of which grew a shade tree with several wicker chairs arranged under its spreading branches. They looked so comfortable and attractive with their bright cretonne cushions. Immediately I was struck by the advantage in the astral world in that there was no danger of rain or robbers. Such things can be left outside for an indefinite period. We went into the cottage, and Daphne showed us first all of the largest of the four rooms that the cottage contained. It was furnished as a lounge with upholstered settees and easy chairs, occasional tables, other small chairs, and a baby grand piano in the corner. There was no sign of ostentation, but it was obvious that personal ideas of the owner had been given full rein, which in the world is often impossible owing to the cost of things that we would dearly like to have. Here there was no such limitation, and it was obvious from looking at this room that the owner was a person of artistic tastes, but with no desire for show in any form. There were several large windows stretching almost the full length of the lounge, and the clear astral light which came through them brought out the beautiful blending of the colors in the tapestry that covered the chairs and settees, and the colors of the Persian carpet that blended so harmoniously with the tapestry, upholstery, and curtains. I realized that perfection was very easy to obtain at this level if one had the right ideas. In the world, one might search for years and then not find a Persian carpet that blended so perfectly with the other colors used in the decoration of the room. The walls, which were an ivory color, were bare but for a couple of etchings and one or two delightful watercolors. It was a room in which one wanted to sit. It looked like a home and not a room for show. From just walking through the rooms, you realized the type of occupant who lived there, and I could well understand Daphne wanting to show us her home. The second largest room was furnished as a bedroom, a very large, typical woman's bedroom, with a divan in one corner and all the other details of furniture which one usually finds in a perfectly furnished room of this type. I was surprised that a bedroom should be necessary in the astral world, where sleep is not part of the ordinary routine of life. Daphne explained that, however, by asking me whether there was not occasions when I felt a desire to relax in a reclining position, merely to think or to read. I had to admit this was so, and Daphne told me that she spent very, very many happy hours relaxing on her divan, thinking, reading, and making plans for the future. The remaining two rooms turned out to be a library and a kitchen. The library was furnished with the same comfort and artistic taste as the other two rooms. Bookcases filled with books, all bound in beautiful Russian leather, completely covered two sides of the room. The mere look of the volumes invited one to sit down and pursue their contents. The kitchen was furnished with all modern appliances, and although I had imagined a kitchen would be unnecessary here, Daphne said she still enjoyed making snacks for parties. Achara again remarked that habits die very slowly in human beings, and usually many years of existence in the astral world passed before these habits were entirely eradicated and forgotten. I should have liked to remain here for a much longer time, but I could see Achara was beginning to feel that the time was ripe for us to be on our way. I made one last request, and that was to spend a few minutes in the garden. It was very delightful wandering among the flower beds, testing the scent of particular flowers, and finding in each case that it was exactly the same as those flowers in the world, but perhaps a little more pronounced. Achara commented on this point by saying that I should only be able to recognize a particular scent if I knew what to expect. For example, if there were a flower which I had never seen before and whose scent was unfamiliar to me, I would only smell what I imagined the scent to be, judging entirely from its appearance, whereas the real scent might be quite different from my imagination. Daphne saw us to the gate, where we wished her au revoir. I assured her that I would most certainly return to visit her if I were able to find my way. We floated into the air again over the top of the Academy building, coming to earth once more at the foot of the rise on which the building stood. Achara again told me to impress the outline of the building on my imagination so that I could make a perfect thought form of it at any time that I was trying to reach it. This I did. Achara then told me that it was time to return to my physical body in Colombo, and that the machinery necessary to effect this transfer was the same as we had used when reaching this sphere of the astral world. He told me not to worry about it, but simply to make an effort of will and endeavor to make a thought form of the lawn outside my bungalow in Colombo. He held my hand, as he had done previously, but he told me that this was merely to give me confidence and was quite unnecessary. I started to concentrate with all my might, and as I did so, I noticed that my surroundings immediately became blurred. And although there was no actual wind resistance noticeable, I had the feeling that I was moving through space. Instinctively, I closed my eyes, holding the thought form of my garden in mind, and after a few seconds, the feeling of movement seemed to cease. On opening my eyes, I saw Achara standing beside me on my own lawn outside my bungalow in Colombo, smiling at my obvious surprise. We immediately entered the bungalow through the locked door, went up the stairs, and through the door of my bedroom. It no longer amazed me that neither of these doors offered any resistance. Sure enough, my body, which I had left so many hours previously, was still lying asleep on the bed, but it seemed to show some slight signs of restlessness, which Achara explained was the normal reaction of a body when the time approached for awakening. He said I would awake in a very short time and emphasized the necessity for me to sit down and record immediately the details of the happenings of the night that passed. He placed his hand just above the top of the head on my body and appeared to concentrate upon the brain cells so that they should give me the necessary assistance in remembering. I do not remember saying goodbye to Achara, nor have I any recollection of his leaving the room, for within seconds I felt the urge to return to my body very strongly within me, and with the slithering movement with which I'd noticed on a previous occasion, I slipped into it again and at once was wide awake. Thank heaven the memory of the night's happenings was still with me, so I immediately got out of bed, put on a dressing gown, and moved over to my desk to commence the record of my journey. It was 5:45, and I found it necessary to switch on the electric light, as it was not light enough here for me either to write or to use my typewriter. The report has taken a considerable time to complete, but as I had carefully arranged beforehand that I was not to be interrupted, I was able to finish it in peace and without any outside distractions. Having breakfasted, I read through my report to make sure I had not forgotten anything. Tonight, I mean to make an attempt on my own to get back to the third sphere using the academy where Daphne works for my landmark. I am really excited this time, for I have something to report. Not that I accomplished anything very wonderful, but at least I had some success. After returning from a walk, I felt physically tired and gradually prepared for bed. I read for a few minutes after getting into bed, then turned out the light and settled myself for sleep. I still remember so clearly what my body looks like lying on the bed that it was no longer necessary for me to visualize myself in a hypothetical mirror, as I had been taught to do in the early days. I don't remember slipping out of my body, but sure enough, there I was in my room with my body lying on the bed, as I had seen it on previous occasions. I went out of my room, through the door, down the stairs, and out the front door to the lawn where Achara and I had stood not so many hours previously. It could only have been about 10:30, for there were still people about, walking and driving along the road. I realized that what I was seeing was the astral counterpart of the cars and of those people, and that I was actually on the lowest or first sphere of the astral world. Now, to make my attempt to get away from that first sphere up to the third sphere where Daphne is living. Now to concentrate the whole of my effort of will and make a thought form of the academy, which Achara made me visualize so carefully early this morning. I closed my eyes and used every ounce of willpower that I possess, and sure enough, the feeling of movement without any wind resistance was the same. I kept the thought form of the academy very clearly in my mind, willing myself to reach the spot, and all at once I seemed to feel the sensation of movement had ceased, and I opened my eyes. Thank heaven, I'd done it. There stood the academy on the top of the hill, just as I had seen it last night. My excitement was almost too great to bear. My excitement was almost too great to bear. In fact, I must have lost control of my faculties entirely, for suddenly everything around me, including the academy, became blurred. And the next thing that I remember, I was waking up in my bed in my physical body in Colombo with my heart beating 13 to the dozen. Oh God, I've messed up entirely. I got there. I actually reached the place where I wanted to be, and through my excitement and lack of control, I'm back again where I started, wide awake. I must have lain awake for at least 2 hours, cursing my stupidity and lack of control. Then I seemed to settle down again and become sleepy. I decided to have another try, and this time to keep control of my faculties so that I would not return to my physical body before it had had its normal quota of sleep. Once again, I concentrated on getting out of my body. At the same time, I kept before me the thought form of the academy building. This time, my exit from my body was a little different from the first occasion. I have no recollection whatsoever of standing in my bedroom as I did earlier in the night, but to my amazement and great joy, I found myself on the same spot from which I was so ruthlessly dragged when I lost control a few hours before. This time I remembered that control was necessary, and somehow I forced myself to remain calm. I know that I sat down on the grass, making no effort at all to go near the academy, but just concentrated deeply on steadying my heartbeats and remaining cool and collected. Then I rose to my feet and floated up to the main entrance of the building, up the stairs, and to the door of the room which I remembered so clearly had been occupied by Daphne the previous night. This time I realized that there was no possibility of going through the door in the same way that one does on the physical plane, for this building was composed of astral matter, and therefore a door here was an obstacle to one's progress, as I also was in astral matter. I knocked on the door and waited, but there was no response. Once again I knocked, wondering whether the noise I made was insufficient for the occupant to hear, but again complete silence reigned, and the door did not open. After a little time I carefully turned the handle and shyly peeped in. I need not have worried, for there was no one there. I recognized the room as the one where I had met Daphne the previous night, so without further preamble I closed the door again, floated down the stairs and out of the front door. Rising in the air, I passed over the rooftop and proceeded on my way, in the hope that Daphne would be at her cottage. I came to earth before I reached the garden city and had another look at its beautiful setting. It was indeed rather like a glimpse of paradise. No wonder that I had wanted to remain, looking at it for a longer period last night. There were even more types of bungalows than I had realized, and I absolutely thrilled at the picture set out before me, and only wished that I had been an artist, so that perhaps after returning to my body, I could have reproduced some semblance of what I now saw in such detail. The garden city occupied an undulating valley, and on all sides the ground gradually sloped upwards until it reached a row of hills plainly visible in the distance. I gazed my fill at the beautiful gardens, which could only exist in a world where there were no limitations of labor or wealth. There was much to be said for the cultivation of imagination in our physical plane existence, for although daydreaming did not produce any practical results whilst we were alive, yet the faculty of being able to imagine in detail most certainly came into its own in the astral world. Here one only had to be able to visualize a thing and think strongly about it for the thought to become at once an established fact, a fact which remained just as long as 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 though which remained just as long as, though thought, one wished the idea to continue. Happy people indeed, and the thought passed through my mind that now I knew a little more of what might be in store for me. I would not fret if I were told that soon it would be my turn to leave the physical world. What I had seen and knew made me realize that it is always possible for people who have left the world to be happy if they really desire happiness. My last thought before an unseen interruption occurred was how easy it was to form a picture in one's mind of almost every occupant of the bungalows. In the physical world, it would be wrong to judge a man from his garden, for probably he has had little or nothing to do with its creation. Here, no gardeners are necessary. Each garden was the creation of the owner, and from it one could make a very good guess as to the outstanding characteristics of the individual. I wished I might have the opportunity of putting my theory to the test. Just then my attention was drawn to a figure in white running towards me along the rustic path, a figure that was shouting as she ran. It was Daphne, of course, and she was obviously very excited. You've got here. Henry, I'm so glad. I've been trying to help you so much during the past few hours, and I thought my efforts had been useless. Some time ago, I felt once that you were near me, and I was almost sure that you had managed to get through the veil, but the impression gradually faded, and I had given up hope. Once again, when once more I felt that you were in the vicinity, I had to come to this spot. I don't know why. And when I saw you standing here in a reverie, but really here, I think my heart stopped beating for a moment for sheer joy. I looked at the graceful figure before me. She seemed just a slip of a girl, dressed in a muslin frock that showed off her girlish figure in the most enchanting lines, and I marveled at her beauty. I don't know why, but this is making me want to cry. Her dark brown hair with golden tints running through it made a perfect I think it's because I can feel their love for each other. Wow. Her dark brown hair with golden tints running through it made a perfect frame for the animated expression on her beautiful face. The eyes, which showed a love so pure that few men see it in the world. Everything that was decent in me seemed to come to the surface, and I felt the age old desire to protect, to hold, and to keep, which is the true feeling of a man for his chosen mate. I think that must be what it is. Yeah, I had no desire to speak, but gently, though firmly, took her in my arms and reverently pressed my kisses on her face and hair. There was no passion in my embrace. There seemed no room for passion, but there was a deep-seated desire to come into closer touch with this child of my dreams, a desire to know her better, and if possible, to add to the happiness that she already had. She returned my kisses, not at all surprised at what I had done. For a moment, her eyes filled with tears. Yep, tears which at once I tried to kiss away, almost before they had appeared. Then she hid her face as we turned, and with my arm around her waist, slowly strolled in the direction of her cottage. When we got there, I led her into the lounge and up to the piano. Play to me, darling, I said. I feel the need for music just at the moment. I pulled up a chair and seated myself beside her. She played what I cannot remember, but I know it was something that depicted joy. I leaned back, closed my eyes in sheer ecstasy, and for a few moments realized the peace that passeth understanding, which once felt makes any other sensation empty and imperfect. I don't know how long we talked, but I remember I told her all about my misery after Charles was killed and how Achara came to me. Also, my experiences up to the evening before, when, with his help, I met her again. We decided that although we were divided by the two of us living at different levels of consciousness, which made an ordinary life together impossible, we would create a life together with things as they were and prove that death was in no sense a barrier either to progress or happiness. We both felt sure that our regard for each other must enable me to pierce the veil whenever necessary, and that I would come to her even though she could not come to me. She told me something of the people who lived in the valley. Many of them were friends of hers whom she wanted me to meet. She explained that people at this level linked up together where their interests were similar, but there was no marriage in the ordinary sense of the word. People there were known by names, but they were Christian names or nicknames, never surnames. She gave me instances of some of them, mentioning that one girl who was always smiling and happy was known as Sunbeam. Another, who always dressed in blue, was called Bluebell, whilst a man who made his life there one long effort at helping other people was known as the Doctor. I said I would look forward to meeting these friends of hers, but how would they take to me, to one who could not belong in the ordinary sense of the word? You will see, she said, at this level, you only see the nice side of people, for there are few petty jealousies such as we have in the world. Everyone can have whatever the other person has, if he or she wants it, merely by making a thought form to that effect. So any striving to live up to the standards of others is unnecessary. People here become themselves, and you will soon realize when you know them as they really are that the old saying, quote, there is so much good in the worst of us and so much bad in the best of us, end quote, is proved to be very true. Oh my, look at that. Sorry, bear with me just a moment. Oh. I hadn't the slightest idea how long all this conversation had taken, but I remember I began to feel a stirring within me which told me quite plainly that my body had had its quota of sleep. I had just time to bid Daphne goodbye when, without further warning, the walls of the room in which we were sitting seemed to melt into a mist which instantly evaporated, and again I felt that sensation of moving through space. At once I was awake in my body in Colombo. There was no halfway break on this occasion. I didn't find myself in my bedroom with my body lying on the bed in front of me. I was wide awake and looking at my watch. I saw that it was 7 o'clock and the sun was shining into my room. At once I got out of bed, almost rushed to my desk to start my report of the night's happenings. And now I have finished. It is 10 a.m., and I have just time to shave, bathe, and have some breakfast before I may expect Achara. I wonder what his reaction will be to all I have to show him. Will he be pleased at the progress his pupil has made, or will he tell me that this is just a flash in the pan, that it is unlikely I shall be able to travel alone in the future, and that much more hard work and study are necessary before I can wander without guidance? I shall know very soon. The picture of Daphne is still very real. Perhaps I missed my happiness by not marrying her in England when I had the chance. I don't know, but I have no regrets. I feel that perhaps there is a future before us which is infinitely more fascinating and beautiful than anything that could have been in our world. Wow. I know this one was a really long one, but I hope that you've enjoyed it. If you are just finding this, you may want to begin with the first. I hope you've enjoyed this one. I'll be back with the next one. I'm going to release these all at once, so I hope you'll join me. If you're not already subscribed to the channel, I hope that you will do so. I also hope that you will like and share the whole playlist though, so that folks can begin at the beginning. Until we meet again, my friends, I hope that you will move towards that which brings you joy in each moment that presents itself to you. It is only a perspective and your perception of that perspective. Mwah. Be well.